All right, so here we are in Module 9. We're on the back half of this online part of the class. There's a little bit of reading about flowering and fruit ecology. This is basically a special kind of mutualism that ecologists often pay special attention to. And so let's try to think about why, right? So one of the questions that often comes up is plants are sessile. And so we have to think about how they respond to the environment. Plants do it really differently from animals. And so it's worth thinking about what this word sessile means, because I think sometimes people have a mistaken idea of what it means for a plant to be sessile. If you look it up in the dictionary, it just means that they're attached at the base. Right, so plants are attached to the ground at the base with their roots in the soil. Their shoots up in the air, usually, not always, but many animals are like this too, right? Barnacles are sessile in the sense that they're attached to rocks. And so being sessile has important implications for how a sessile organism responds to the environment. And I just want you to sort of notice that sessile doesn't mean the absence of movement. And one of the reasons it's worth thinking about this is because all organisms everywhere on the earth, it doesn't matter whether they're bacteria or animals or plants, they have to solve the same basic set of problems, right? They have to find mates, they have to find resources or food, they have to not die in a variety of ways to survive the environment, but also survive potentially attacks from other organisms. And so all the domains of life are equally successful at this, but they have completely different ways of solving these problems, right? So sometimes students imagine that when we show you this tree of life, that some of the stuff at the base of the tree are less evolved, and that's completely wrong, right? They're equally successful. Bacteria and archaebacteria and protists and ferns and moss, they're all equally successful at solving these problems. They just do it in different ways from a bear or a pine tree. And so what we want to talk about today are sort of what we think of as dispersal syndromes, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But, you know, if you think about it, dispersal is relatively easy if you're an animal, right? So there's reasons why you might want to go to different places to either, you know, colonize new habitat or maybe to avoid inbreeding. And so if you're an animal, it's relatively easy. And so here is a picture of an Arctic tern. And there's this study from 2009 that showed they actually migrate from one pole to the other every year. So they can fly all the way around the planet in a year. That's pretty crazy. But as a sessile plant, you're attached at the base usually, right? And so it's less easy to move around. And so one of the ways that plants do this is with pollen and with seeds, right? They're able to disperse their genes through pollen, and they are able to disperse their offspring through mobile seeds, and that's what dispersal syndromes are about. It's worth remembering, though, that before there were things like flowers and fruit, plants still could disperse. They actually had spores, that sperm and spores that simply disperse through water or on the wind, right? So bryophytes and pteridophytes still use this strategy on land. So both, bryophytes and ferns have mobile sperm. They actually swim around in the soil, which is kind of cool. And so these dispersal syndromes where animals and plants kind of work together, or you could actually more accurately think about it as plants sort of co-opting animals to do some dispersal for them, it's sort of a match made by coevolution. So we can look back to the very earliest land plants that came on land about 400 million years ago. And adaptations to survive the harshness of dry land relative to the moist ocean was one of the first things that both plants and animals had to deal with. Right, so what we see is vascular plants evolving about 400 million years ago, and at the same time we see the earliest sort of arthropods showing up on land. But what's cool is that adaptation, so, vascular tissue was a useful way of dealing with water. You could move water up and away from the ground. But the first seed plants start appearing almost as soon, just shortly thereafter. And adaptations that start using animals to disperse seeds appear almost as soon as terrestrial animals appear. And then, not that long after that, we get flowering plants, which are basically purely about working with animals to attract animals to disperse pollen. Right? So using alternative solutions to the basic problems of life, plants and animals have mutually benefited each other for millions and millions of years. But it's important to remember that before and after animals, right, dispersal still occurs with motile sperm and with other mechanisms in different plants. So what are dispersal syndromes? They're relatively straightforward. They're just suites of traits that have evolved by natural selection that's imposed by different vectors, by sort of co-evolution, depending on the vector. And by vector, we just mean something that moves plant parts. And again, here we could sort of think of traits as being like a phenotype. And there's two main types of these dispersal syndromes that I want to talk about today and get you to think about. One of them is pollination syndromes. These are the different adaptations that plants have to pollinate their flowers. And basically, the key is that depending on the vector that plants use to move their pollen, you can often understand this sort of convergent evolution on traits that help plants move their pollen. And then we want to talk about fruit dispersal syndromes, which basically works the same way, that certain types of dispersal look the same, right? And so the key then is that these syndromes reflect convergent evolution, that similar types of vectors impose similar selective pressures and produce similar traits among very different taxa. These things are fairly intuitive, as you'll see. Basically, plants generally converge on traits that are going to be the least expensive way to work with the vector to disperse them. And you might think about what I mean by least expensive in the context of, say, that board game, right, with benefits and costs, right? So the benefit here is obviously dispersal. But you might think about what the costs would be in this situation. And so if we were in a room together, I would probably ask you, why might it be useful to know about syndromes, whether they're pollination syndromes or fruit dispersal syndromes, right? Well, one of the reasons is that if you know something about the morphology and behavior of the vector, you might be able to predict the flowers that are associated with, right? So let's say you're an animal biologist and you actually don't know what this animal is feeding on. Well, you might be able to make some educated hypotheses based on the morphology of the animal. And the other way around, if you knew the flower, right? So if we were studying this flower, but we didn't know who was visiting it, by understanding some of the traits of the flower, we might be able to make predictions about the animal that pollinates it. So I think I'm going to stop the video here, and then we'll talk about specific details of pollination syndromes in the next video.